So again, everybody, we're going to do just a straight up Q&A. So as I said, we're going to jump to the leftover questions from last week's Q&A. And then we're going to jump into new ones. So type your questions into the Q&A feature. We'll get to as many as you can. So the first question here, if porn is such a problem, why not just ban it? Or is it only addicts who have issues with it? And I'll stop there because there's about 6 questions poked into this one. So if porn is such a problem, why not just ban it?
Yeah, really interesting idea. Well, there's several reasons to make that complicated. One is, what is porn? And there's a broad view of what pornography is. I think some Supreme Court person or somebody in high authority once said, I recognize it when I see it, but it's really hard to get a definition around that. The other thing is just kind of personal freedoms and the culture in the United States and how we approach things like that, and kind of hands off what I do in private. But that said, there are some issues. Porn is inherently addictive, I think, and especially for younger folks that have it easily accessible and private and free, and it's just highly influential. So I think it's a problematic thing, just like alcohol, for example, which is a legal entity, but it can cause an awful lot of problems. So, but I think we can just not say ban it totally. I think there are people that probably enjoy porn that don't become addicted to it. And it has a role, sometimes even in relationships. Couples will use porn as part of their sexual play and interaction. So I think it's hard to kind of make a broad brush on it, but what we have to do is really make sure we're aware of people that get into trouble with it. And that's can be a large group of people, including, as I mentioned, a lot of adolescents and even younger, who have found their way to viewing porn, and that can be a problem, I think, for them. So we just have to be responsible about it, and take good care. But I think it does. There's all kinds of political treatises written on that, from women's rights. There's a lot of misogyny in it, and now we're seeing a lot of that expanded. There's a huge increase in transgender porn last 5 years, just going through the roof, and a lot of that is quite demeaning and also misogynistic, in fact. So there's a lot of social problems that are nested within porn as well. But I think to have such a broad brush as just banning it is something we don't really do very readily in the United States.
Yeah, and I also, there's a couple of things I want to add to that. Number one, at Seeking Integrity, we take no stance on whether certain kinds of sex or pornography are good or bad. You know, our job is to help addicts. That's what we do. We help addicts. We have people who have problems with it, with absolutely no judgment. We don't bring any judgment to the table, but a lot of people do. And there are countries around the world who have tried to heavily regulate porn or to ban it altogether, with absolutely zero success, by the way. It's on the internet. You know, the internet is, we can try to regulate things on the internet all we want. It doesn't work. Ask China, ask the UK, where they've tried to heavily regulate porn. It just doesn't work. People go where they want to go. It's out there and people can find it. So banning it's not going to work just practically, and you know, however you feel about it, banning it's not going to happen. I mean, look at prohibition in the U.S. in the 20s, or was it the 20s that we had prohibition?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My history might be a little off. It didn't work. I mean, you know, everybody just started making their own booze. You ban porn, everybody's going to make their own. They're doing it anyway.
Right.
So, yeah. Next question, can you be sex positive and a sex addict?
So let me define what I view as sex positive, first of all.
Yeah, David is a sexologist, so in addition to being a certified sex addiction therapist, so he's highly qualified to answer this question from kind of two different angles.
Right, so sexologist is,
yeah,
it's the training program for sex therapy. So it's sex positive basically is the philosophy that sex is a good thing, sex is an inherent part of our life and happiness, and it should be a part of our lives, and we should make it playful and fun and exploratory and connected, and that basically sex is a good thing in and of itself. And I ascribe to that. I really do. I think it's an important piece I think sometimes in the old days, especially with sex addiction, it was more about just controlling this out of control behavior without so much notion, okay, now what? How do we incorporate some healthy sex back into our lives? And that's where the sexology piece, I think, is more or bent or oriented toward that. So that's the idea of sex positivity, which I think is a good thing. Sex addiction is also something that people can get and have to recover from and address. I think in recovery, yeah, I think the way I see that plays out, if you can hold those two things, those two thoughts at the same time, I can imagine somebody who is struggling to reincorporate sex in a way that they never really were able to achieve with their addiction, although they may have tried with their addiction, but really true intimacy, true vulnerability, really being able to trust your partner, being able to be playful, being able to enjoy it without having to get blasted on drugs or chemicals to disinhibit yourself enough to enjoy it. Looking at sex for what sex is supposed to be looked at, which is intimate and fun and connected and in a loving way. And sex addiction is really just using sex, the behavior of sex, as a coping mechanism to deal with other things or not deal with them at all. And so really with sex addiction, sex has kind of been, so probably misuse a word, perverted for other causes, right? And so people are using sex, if they're a sex addict, like I as an alcoholic would use alcohol as a way of dealing with stuff or not dealing with stuff. That's quite different than I think for sex positivity. So in recovery, I think a lot of people struggle to find, okay, how can I invite sex back into my life in a meaningful way that actually helps me, helps my self-esteem, helps my connections, helps my relationships in a way that's healthier. So I think, yeah, in recovery, I think people can embrace sex positivity and bring sex back into their lives in a healthy way.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I'm a recovering sex addict. I am very sex positive. Sex can be a wonderful thing for all the reasons David just described. In our online work groups, in the level 3 sex addiction work group, in the very last one of the level 2 porn addiction work group, we talk about healthy sexuality. It's about what's next. After I stop with the problem behaviors, what's next? Because we all have a sex drive to one degree or another. And, we're rewarded neurochemically for sex. It feels good because, if we don't engage in sex, our species will die out. Now, I'm a gay man, so I'm not reproducing, but my brain still is wired to enjoy sex. This is evolution at its finest. We enjoy food because we need to eat or we will die. We get pleasure from things that are life sustaining. And we just need to, but addicts don't use sex in a life sustaining way. We use it in an escapist way, the same reason, like David said.
I would say misuse
an alcoholic's drink. Yeah, we misuse it. Yeah, so, but yeah, absolutely. The goal, I think, of sex and recovery is to have a healthy, enjoyable, non-problematic sex life, and that's what sex positive is all about. Yeah, and kinks, fetishes, you can have a kink and be sober. You can practice your kink and be sober. You just need consenting partners and to not have it screwing up your life.
Right. And let me just say that a little bit too, because I oftentimes get guys in early recovery, especially chemsex guys who combine sex with amphetamines, who basically say, okay, in recovery, I'm going to be doomed to a life of vanilla, boring, or no sex at all, just because it seems so different than the kind of hyped up, amped up sexual acting out they've been doing in their addiction. And I think that's just totally wrong, because first of all, we're inviting sex back into our lives, and it doesn't have to be vanilla or boring. It can be whatever you want it to be. The problem is, I think, is if we get into areas that where sex so merged with our addiction, we have to be really careful about those areas. But I've had clients with some extended recovery who were able to go back into those behaviors that they used to enjoy only under the influence of some drug and enjoy it sober. And that's what it's all about, and as Scott said, the idea is consenting adults. And beyond that, it's what can we do in a healthy way that's affirming. I think, sometimes, I don't know, Scott, if you're in the work group, sometimes we do these contrasting lists of kind of healthy sex versus unhealthy sex, and controlling and degrading versus affirming and connecting and that kind of thing. And there's lists that kind of contrast that flesh that out sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, mostly when I teach it, I do a lot of focus on how we add meaning to sex, which is what we don't do in our addiction. But I also, I always make it clear that, having a quickie with your partner is also a really good thing if you're both in the mood for a quickie. It doesn't have to be some spiritual experience. It can be just hot sex with someone you love, or even like and care about, and if you're both on the same page, that's great. I mean, that's part of being sex positive. It doesn't always have to be this earth-shattering thing, but you need the earth-shattering connection at least once in a while to really give it meaning, I think. Personal opinion.
Agree.
Can a sex addict engage in healthy masturbation or porn use?
So yeah, let me talk about that, because I think when I work with clients, I try to do this idea of what's the intention here. And so if, say, I'm thinking I'm a sex addict in recovery, and past a certain point, we usually ask our guys in early recovery to, commit to a certain period of abstinence, and we do that just to allow the brain to kind of shift gears a little bit back to more normal levels of stimulation. It's confusing, and relapse is heightened if they don't give it that space. But once you're there, once you're kind of in the groove and living your life, I ask people to think about intention. If I'm considering masturbating, what's my intention? Is it because I need to fall asleep? Is it because I'm stressed because I just paid bills? Did I just have a fight with my lover? Am I bored? All those things that really masturbation isn't, I think, such a great idea, because in the addictions stimulant, I'm going to contrast this another way, but in this way, kind of the wrong way, in my mind, I'm using masturbation to disconnect, to soothe myself, to self-medicate, to step out of discomfort of either boredom or an argument or something like that. It's just, I'm using sex to put myself in a different headspace. I think in a way that I could easily use beer or alcohol or marijuana. It's just the same thing, just to soothe myself. On the other hand, if I'm using sex to connect with feelings, to just enjoy myself, to really pleasure myself, to be connected with my body, to be in the moment and present, I think that's okay. I really do. I think it's all about the intention. So masturbation is pretty clear to me. Porn gets a little foggier for me, because I think for somebody in recovery, sex addict in recovery, porn is tricky, because porn by definition is this external force that's disconnecting just inherently, disconnecting from those feelings. I was talking about being connected to. And porn is such a powerful opiate, in terms of a drug-like effect, in that instant mood changer. And porn starts to reset that dopamine level to higher levels than we see in nature sometimes, because porn can be incredibly stimulating. If we get off into one of our little areas that our arousal template lights up, suddenly porn can be a more attractive alternative than real life. And I think that can become a problem for people. And by the way, one of the questions I sometimes get asked, if I'm in a couple, if there's two of us, what about porn in that situation? And sometimes people use porn to like spice up, to get kind of turned on for each other. I guess that's okay, but as a sex therapist, I worry that suddenly there's a third person, there's a third entity in that relationship, and both parties are connected to the porn and less so to each other. And so I think porn sometimes is as an assistive device to kind of ramp up to ignite the flames of passion. I think it can be problematic, because suddenly both parties are more kind of engaged in the porn than each other. So that's the pitfall there. So I'm a little more hesitant.
Never do both parties want porn. It's usually only one.
Yeah. Scott, what do you think about that? Because you deal with guys a lot too.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I mean, I can tell you, when I first got into recovery, porn was not as ubiquitous and easily accessible as it is today. And it wasn't the particularly huge part of my addiction. So I had it in my middle circle, like slippery behavior, but not a bottom line behavior. And I had masturbation as a bottom line behavior. And about a year in, those two things switched. The porn world changed. It was much more accessible, and it was much more addictive. And with everything else out of the way, I sort of realized oh, need to quit the porn too. But masturbation, I approach it the way David does. If I just want to zone out or numb out, the answer is no. But if I plan like, okay, on Saturday evening, I'm going to stay in, I'm going to make myself a nice dinner, I'm going to watch my favorite movie, I'm going to take a hot bath, and then I'm going to have a little date with myself. Because I'm single and that's my only outlet, I think it's okay, but it's not a spur of the moment because I'm having a crummy day. That's using it as a drug, rather than as a way of connecting to myself. And sex can be a way of connecting to ourselves as well as another person, and that's how I view it. I don't know if David agrees or not, but that's kind of how I approach it. Is you said, why do I want to masturbate? Okay, well, that is the question. Why do I want to do this? And that always gives me my answer. So, okay. After being medically tested and being sober from porn and chemsex for 8 months, I still feel my porn-induced erectile dysfunction is not gone. I had sexual problems with porn long before, and part of my chemsex escalation was so that I could perform better. It seems I had sexual issues long before overlapping with porn addiction since childhood. Can porn addiction be the cause of this? Is this a different mental health issue? I tend to be in my head a lot and not present during sex, which I think is the issue. Lot there, but all around porn, chemsex, and porn-induced erectile dysfunction.
Right. So first of all, to kind of eliminate a few of the factors there in that equation, porn by itself there is a thing called porn-induced erectile dysfunction. So we know that porn, like any addictive behavior, that resets that dopamine platform so high that suddenly our brains change in the way that porn is the only thing that gets us aroused enough to function. So you have these classic cases of guys that have erectile dysfunction with their partners, but they can get an erection immediately with porn, because porn has a higher level of intensity. It's changing images. There's novelty one after the other. They're in total control. There's no element of inhibition or worry or performance. So it's a whole different thing. But so porn by itself can cause those issues. With chemsex, sorry to say that chemsex really causes problems. I think the single biggest challenge I see of guys in recovery from chemsex, meaning the ritualized kind of combination of usually amphetamines or a drug, but usually amphetamines and sex or porn kind of combined together, which like puts the level of intensity through the roof, and no human experience can compare with that, frankly. And so that really kind of burns into the brain this image that's quite difficult to get past. But I think it gets more complicated than that, because first of all, in recovery, we know that if we think about using meth in the fantasies, it's basically has the same brain effect as if we actually ingested meth. And so I have sometimes guys who are not using their drugs, they're totally abstinent, but once in a while, because they have such trouble getting an erection or having an orgasm, they'll take a sneak little peek at meth porn or any kind of porn. And it brings that right back. So they're keeping themselves basically frozen in recovery. They're not moving past that porn connection because they're looking at the meth porn, even though they're not using the drug. But you named something else, and I think this is important to say too. Most of the guys that I've treated who have chemsex did so initially because of the huge disinhibiting properties that it had. And those disinhibiting properties helped them overcome a lot of barriers they had with them for a long time. And that may have been due to trauma or some kind of abuse. It may have been accused of body dysmorphia or body shame, just being shy, being very much inhibited. So all those issues, being not trusting, having intimacy issues, which a lot of, I think Dr. Robb says every sex addict has. I think I agree with that. These intimacy attachment disorders that we see so commonly in sex addiction and porn addiction. So there's a lot of underlying issues, I think, that the chemsex was kind of covering over and medicating. Kind of, it was an assistive device to get over those things. But you take the chemsex away, and it's made the problem worse, because it's reset that intensity level so high that you have to get that readjusted. But even then, there's issues of trust and vulnerability and intimacy and body and all that other stuff that has to be dealt with to make sex comfortable. And that's a long process, and it's a frustrating process, but it's totally rewarding if you can work your way through that. And I do have clients, and I don't mean to paint a really hopeless picture, because I do have clients that go on from chemsex to have really wonderful and very satisfying sex lives. And to be totally honest, I have clients, long run, especially the older guys, we see some guys in their 50s and 60s just getting the meth. They often need some kind of erectile dysfunction treatment to help them get erect after porn use. And that can go on for a long time. So it does
erectile dysfunction can be a physical issue. It can be a neurochemical issue, which is what happens with chemsex or heavy porn use. The brain resets, the pleasure center resets. Or it can just be a shame issue. Like, I carry around a lot of sexual shame, and it makes it hard for me to perform sexually. I think most sex addicts have this degree of sexual shame that causes performance issues. There's just anxiety, or there's shame about what I want, or shame about what I'm doing. Pat Carnes did a study almost 30 years ago, and one of his findings was that sex addicts we tend to be really bad at sex. And it's just because we carry around, I think in a lot of respects, it's because we carry around so much baggage. And in a lot of other respects, it's because of what we do to the reward center in our brain. We just raise the bar so high that a single real world partner, doesn't provide the intensity we need to get aroused. And it can take a long time to reset. I mean,
right. So. Could I just say one more thing about erectile dysfunction drugs? Because in the best of circumstances, they only work about 80% of the time. But the way they work is important, and it's confusing because sometimes people don't understand why they're not working. And when we've been talking tonight about how porn and amphetamines and sex addiction can kind of reset this minimum level of stimulation required to get aroused. That's in the brain. And so the brain has to have this minimum level of arousal. And then once that gets triggered, there's a tipping point, it sends a signal down to our groin. And that's where two different chemicals actually are released that help us have an erection. Those erectile dysfunction drugs work on those two chemicals in the groin. If the signal never gets there because of the porn addiction or the sex addiction, they're not going to work because we're not aroused enough to even signal those chemicals to be released. So that's why it often doesn't work for a lot of people.
Yeah, when I write about porn-induced erectile dysfunction, I always say Viagra is not going to help you. If you've got porn-induced or chemsex-induced erectile dysfunction, Viagra is not going to help. And that's why it's two different mechanisms, and you need both of them functioning to get an erection.
Exactly.
So, my soon-to-be husband of 25 years is currently in rehab for drug abuse, cocaine and marijuana, and a gambling addiction. He admitted himself on December 1st after I found out he's been having sex with transsexual prostitutes. This is not the first time I've found him seeking out porn, sex clubs, etc. over the years. I believe he has a sex addiction as well, but he is still in denial. If he gets sober from gambling and drugs, but not for his sex addiction, will he ever get better? I think this is a very insightful and thoughtful question, and I know David has very strong feelings about it, and I do too.
Yeah, so I have this thing, I call it kind of the whack-a-mole syndrome, where when various addictive behaviors, whether it's gambling or drugs or sex or porn or different kinds of drugs, food, exercise, shoplifting even, those are all symptoms. They're symptomatic behaviors, right? And it's very easy. And this is a problem I have with a lot of the treatment industry that treats drug addiction, because they treat the drug side, but they're not even looking for the sex addiction side. And a lot of people that go through drug addiction treatment are also sex addicts or gamblers or other things, and they don't pick it up. These are all just different ways. If I'm doing amphetamines and I'm doing porn, those are just two different ways of triggering the same kind of response in my brain, two different ways of getting there, but they're the same thing, the same result. And so the things you mentioned, the drugs he's using, gambling is probably the closest cousin to sex addiction in terms of the brain and the brain function. It's just an easy sidestep over into sex addiction. And by the way,
particularly with porn because of that.
oh God, yeah, right. It's just yeah, I could get off on the way slot machine algorithms work and Facebook and porn. It's all the same stuff. So that these guys know how to manipulate our brains, even if we don't know what's happening. But the behaviors you mentioned, the kind of the erotic interest in, and I would use the term transgender, by the way, in transgender individuals and other kinds of things, that's all really indicative to me of a sex addiction. And I would guess that there's this big glaring hole in that cluster of addictive disorders that he's willing to recognize. And I think myself, I think had some behaviors that I would prefer to own up to this before I got into full recovery versus the real deal, which was my drug of choice. I didn't want to, that was just trying to protect that. So I was looking at all these peripheral behaviors, but I think it's probably really important to have some kind of assessment for sex addiction in that context. And if for some reason he's not already, I think unless he gets full treatment, there's going to be a real high risk of him becoming that. And by the way, I think we're talking about all these kind of ships, on the deck of the Titanic, right? Chairs we talk about, but unless we deal with what's underneath and the core issues, what's causing all these addictive behaviors, people are just going to find other ways to express itself. And I think what's under most of that, by the way, is trauma or adverse childhood experiences or shame, these issues that go way back, long before we ever pick up a drug or find porn. These are kind of the underlying issues and our core beliefs about ourselves. And unless we correct those, and that's no quick fix, right? These are deeper issues that require some commitment and insight and good therapy. But boy, unless we deal with those, this stuff is going to keep popping up. So I mean, it's like you have everything there except sex addiction. And I can see where it fits into that cluster of stuff, and it's just not named, but I would bet it's there. Just my opinion.
Yeah, David, I mean, this is as gambling addicts, porn addicts, some of these other, the stimulant drugs. This is a search for intensity as a means of escape because we don't want to feel something. And these are also related, and we have to kind of treat them all at once, correct?
Yes. The old belief was, and it makes sense, if somebody has an active drug addiction, you can't really do any kind of other kinds of therapy unless you get that under control, the person gets sober. But if that drug addiction and there's a co-occurring or happening at the same time, sex addiction or gambling addiction or exercise addiction or food addiction, we have to treat all of those at the same time, all those addictive disorders, or else it'll just switch from one to the other. And so it really does require, and I had a mentor once who said, people find what they're trained to look for. And I think the way we educate addictive professionals in this country, we're not trained to look for a broad range of things. We're trained to look for specific kinds of behaviors, and we miss everything else to the detriment of our clients. So I think that's one of the things about Seeking Integrity, I think is almost unique in that we take this broad view and then look at, well, okay, why is this all going on? What's happening? But yeah, they're all intensity addictions. And by the way, every intensity addict, it's a kind of a two-cycle thing. There's the going up, right? The amping up with amphetamines and gambling or extreme sports or gaming or all that stuff. But then there's that remorse recovery phase in the addiction cycle where people come down. And then there's this other side, the self-medicating side to treat the symptoms of the acting out. And that can be, benzodiazepines or Xanax or alcohol or food or TV, a whole different set of behaviors and activities that aren't so much about intensity, but more about shutting down and going numb. And so usually there's a complement of the up and the down, and there's two different kind of sets of behaviors and drugs on each side. So it's useful to our clients to look at the whole thing.
Yeah, a single addiction has, this new background doesn't let me do anything, it drives me nuts. Hold on, I'm gonna turn this off so I can talk with my hands. A second. None. There. Okay. All right, and I'm just going to stop mirroring my video. So now when I go this way, I actually go this way on screen. Anyway, whatever. A normal addiction cycle for one addiction, it just spins. I get triggered, I go around, I act out, I feel bad about it, and the bad leads me right back into the trigger. cross-addicted people like myself, because I'm a cross-addicted sex addict, alcohol and drug addict, I would hit this despair stage right before spinning back to, and I would spin off into an alcohol and drug cycle and get back to the despair stage and spin back. So instead of being a circle, it was kind of always a figure eight for me. I would spin from one to the other. They each had their own addiction cycle, and they touched at the ebb, at the low point. I never did the drugs with the sex. That's a chemsex addict when you do them together to heighten it, or for a number of other reasons. But yeah, what David was talking about is we just kind of spin and spin and spin. And, your husband he could spin and spin and spin. He could spin from gambling to drugs to gambling to drugs. But when he wants sexual intensity, that's going to drag him back into the drug use, which is going to drag him back into the gambling. If he doesn't address all of these intensity addictions at the same time, the one that's not addressed is going to drag him back out. And that's personal experience of seeing it. That's experience from people like David and Rob, who particularly David, who is at the forefront of these multiple addictions, particularly the intensity addictions. This is what we found. I don't mean to jump on your horse, but I mean, you're the one who knows way more about this than anybody else on the planet. But this is what you found, is right?
Absolutely. Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah.
I'm going to drag you down the rabbit hole real quick. Can you talk about intermittent reward and the power of intermittent reward and how that plays into gambling addictions and porn addiction and other intensity addictions?
Right. So I spoke.
And this is the algorithms we're talking about.
Yeah, I spoke a few minutes about these algorithms that basically they're formulas that are set up to prey on certain quirks of how our minds work. And there's a neurologist named Robert Sapolsky who has this famous quote that I'll paraphrase, but basically it said, he said, if the concept of maybe is in an equation, then humans are totally vulnerable to that. What he means by that, if I'm at a slot machine in Vegas and I keep pulling and dropping whatever I put in there, in my mind, maybe I'm going to win, and the algorithm it'll give me a reward once in a while. But overall, over the long haul, I'll lose, and that's also programmed into that. But that maybe piece, and that's like catnip for the human brain. It makes it extremely difficult to stop. It's the same thing with Facebook and Instagram, with how many likes will I get? Maybe I'll get likes if I share this. Maybe I'll get rewards. Maybe it'll be shared a couple times. Maybe I'll get positive comments. If I'm on Grindr or Tinder or Scruff, maybe this one will be the one. Maybe that one. Maybe there's somebody here. Always the next. Porn. Maybe the next one's going to be hotter than this one. So I'm going to just edge a little bit longer and not orgasm yet because there's some, and it just keeps us rolling along. And what it keeps rolling along is it's giving us dopamine every time we do that. And it's this, we get addicted to that dopamine feed basically. And so that idea of maybe, it's not a yes or a no, it's just maybe. It's like, okay, maybe the next one, maybe the next one. And it just pulls us along into the depths. Yeah. And that's called intermittent reward, by the way, that idea of like, once in a while I get it, sometimes I don't. And I never know when.
Thank you for indulging me.
Yeah.
We finished up last week's question, so I'm going to jump us into this week's question. I'm a male addict in recovery. I'm sober for about 11 months. Congratulations. Why does it feel like I'm putting myself when I'm trying to show my partner empathy and validation of her feelings? I'm not sure why does it feel like I'm putting myself? Kidding myself maybe when I'm trying. So addicts at 11 months who try to show empathy and validate, putting myself down. Why does it feel like I'm putting myself down? Thank you. When I'm trying to show my partner empathy and validation of her feelings.
I think for a lot of addicts in recovery, especially in early recovery, and I'd say, 11 months is nothing to sneer at for sure, but you're still in the process there. And I think, empathy is something that we get kind of disconnected from. And that's literal, by the way. That's something that happens in our brains through intensity addictions, whether it's amphetamine or like cocaine or methamphetamine or porn or sex. It disconnects us from feelings, and remember, empathy is defined as the ability to feel what someone else is feeling. I've talked here before in this webinar about the different brain structures that help us do that, and how that's kind of an inherent part of human survival. That really enabled humans to have this big evolutionary leap forward, because we could kind of feel each other and determine and act as a team of people. Addicts, we talk about it as being self-centered, we talk about it as being narcissistic, but all the flavors of those words describe this kind of feeling of like the addict doing their thing, right? And they're intellectually aware of the damage or the harm they're causing, but they're really out of touch with the feeling of it. And we have some processes at Seeking Integrity to help clients reconnect with that empathy. But I think it's still, it doesn't come naturally for a long time. And I think maybe that's what you're saying, because it's a mistake to think that if you're validating someone else, you're invalidating yourself. And I'm reading between the lines here. Maybe that's what's going on here. But I think if we're trying to validate someone and let them know that it makes sense to us that they're feeling the way they're feeling, or that we can understand how they would feel an emotion that they're feeling, that's a good thing. And I think I think unless we're aware of our own feelings, it can feel kind of unnatural. It can feel like an intellectual exercise. What I would suggest is really dropping down into your heart space here, your heart center, and really speaking from there. And I think if we're trying to figure out, and it's normal in early recovery, it's like, okay, I got to figure out, I got to say the right words. What do they look like? How should I be? And it sometimes comes off as a bit of an intellectual exercise. I think if you can drop down here, there's an authenticity that comes from this space, is one suggestion I would have. But I think it does get better with time as you get more in touch with your own feelings and with your partner's feelings. Then it becomes more fluid and natural. But Scott, I'm curious about what you make of that.
I think you nailed it. I mean, I immediately remember my own experience of trying to, feel and express empathy. It felt like I was not being true to myself, because it was this intellectual exercise that was just very the antithesis of how I operated at that time. And I just had to keep acting as if, which again, just felt kind of untrue to myself. And I didn't feel like I was putting myself down, but I felt like I wasn't being me, because I wasn't. I wasn't. But that was a good thing. I was trying to become the me I wanted to be. So I would invite you to reframe this as, yeah, it's not natural right now. I'm trying to become a person for whom this is natural. And so I'm going to do this, even if it feels weird and awkward and not me.
And I have two other suggestions. I would, first of all, one great way to kind of build up empathy is to check it out. Check out, gee, I can imagine you would be feeling XYZ. Do I have that right? Just kind of start to connect and get feedback, and also share your discomfort or share your feelings. I think sometimes we don't feel that we can say, hey, this is hard for me. I'm truly trying to get this. It's the authenticity that comes through. But I think sometimes we feel like we have to do this right, and we can't express any kind of uncertainty that, am I doing this right or not? And just, I would share your discomfort, or whatever that feeling is, maybe not discomfort, but your uncertainty about it. And that's can also be a tool to build empathy. Just sharing what you're feeling and back and forth about the process can build some great empathy. So.
Yeah, and validating your partner's feelings when maybe you think those feelings aren't merited, given the current situation, that can be very hard. And you may feel like you're putting yourself down or taking blame for something that's not your fault. And sometimes recovering sex addicts, when you marry someone, you marry all of them, including all of their past traumas. And if you betray them with sex addiction or infidelity, all of their past relationship traumas are going to come up. So you may be paying for, your spouse's father leaving the family when she was 5. She may be reacting to that as well as what you did. And it doesn't seem fair to you, but if you love your partner, you sit there and you validate her feelings, even if you're thinking, but you're blaming me for something I didn't do. You know, and you don't have to take ownership of the fact that her father betrayed her. I'm just using a what if, but you do need to validate her feelings that she's upset and your betrayal has triggered this and brought these old wounds up. So, you know, again, it's layers and layers, and we don't know the specific situation, but yeah. Thank you, gentlemen. Thanks to you. I believe my sex addict is in recovery. Oh, you're very welcome. I know you're sex addict and I quite like him. I agree, he's in recovery.
Okay.
So, what's your opinion of telling adult children about the addiction? Great question.
Yeah, so I think it's important to say what's going on. I think one of the dynamics of families where addiction is active is that things happen and the reality is never acknowledged or discussed. And that's crazy making. That can, if I see something and I just know in my gut that's happening, but I'm told, no, that's not what's happening at all. That gaslighting is really destructive. And so adult children, you know, first of all, no kid, whether they're a child or an adult, really wants to know very many details about their parents' sex life. That's just not something anybody really wants to know. However, when there's something like a sex addiction that does impact both parents, I think it is important to acknowledge that and to disclose that there's been some challenges and difficulties and that people are working on it. I don't think you have to go into the details. Sometimes people do find it relieving or helpful to talk about what kind of behaviors perhaps. I don't think it's a good idea to go into specifics, but dad had a problem with, strip clubs and escorts, and we're working on it now. Whatever seems to be appropriate. I don't think details are ever helpful, but I think just the general shape of what happened and a general acknowledgement of what's going on and an invitation to those adult children to share their feelings, because that's really, again, where healing takes place, is if we can get all this stuff out in a healthy way and in a respectful discussion. I think that really does further the healing, as opposed to more wounding or recreating old family dynamics of secrets or shame or all that stuff. Now, when kids are younger, it's a little bit of a different problem. However, I even think kids who are adolescent, kids who are I'd probably draw the line at 8 to 10, maybe too young to even talk about mommy and daddy having a problem, except that we're working on our marriage and daddy's trying to get himself better, or mommy is, or whatever, without the details of the sexual component. I think an adolescent is already aware of what's going on and probably could use a similar discussion as the adult children have. Again, without going into great detail, but to really acknowledge what's going on. I think that really sets the platform for healing. So I think when we keep it a secret, or I always worry that there's a lot of shame then around that, and what's going on there. And it just, I think it maybe perpetuates some of the wounds that really could be cleared up in a cleaner way.
So David, what about when one partner, and I know this happens with not just adult children in particular, but also siblings and parents, where they start taking sides, and the betrayed partner or the cheating partner encourages them to take sides and pushes them to take sides and skews the facts and everything. How can that be avoided? And what are the repercussions if it's not avoided?
Yeah, that's a really painful situation where children basically become kind of weaponized in this proxy battle between the two parents. I think it's really destructive. That is one big way to mess up a kid and create a little addict down the road. Those are people that are going to be, paying for therapy in 20 years. I think that's a bad way to go, because kids obviously feel something's wrong. They don't know the details. They shouldn't know the details, but they need some acknowledgement and reassurance that they are not the problem, because younger kids especially take ownership of that, and they will assume they are the problem unless they're told otherwise. And I think sometimes I do see parents playing one off the other, one trying to make themselves feel better by kind of winning the kids over and villainizing the other. That's never, ever, ever helpful. And I think it's a mistake. And I would really encourage both those parents to take that to a couples therapy or take it to their own therapy and work it out, because that's really misplaced anger. It's a cheap shot for the benefit, for short-term benefit, typically, of one partner to kind of win the kids over for that validation. I think it's the people who pay the price for that are the kids. And so I think it's a bad idea. That, I'm not saying a relationship where there's an addict and a married spouse, there's going to be problems, there's going to be hurt, there's going to be pain, there may be separation and divorce, but there are places and formats where those kind of feelings can be talked about and discussed in a more appropriate way. And it's not through the kids as a proxy war. So that concerns me whenever I see that. And by the way, it happens not just with young kids. I've seen that with adult children as well, where they take sides. And
dragged into it, and in-laws and everything. It can get really ugly. Can you please explain the primary differences between codependency and prodependence? You want me to take
should be here. I'll do it. Then I think you should elaborate. I guess my understanding is that the traditional notion of codependence, which has been around since the 80s, really was born out of this idea that if you get involved with a sex partner or with a sex addict rather, or any kind of addict at all, there maybe is something wrong with you. Like, what trauma did you have in your past that would attract you to somebody like this? And it pathologizes the partner. And unfortunately, it oftentimes if somebody will get into treatment, the wives are called in and said, well, this is, let's talk about you and your problems and your childhood. And it's like, wait, I'm not the patient here. And it can be very off-putting and very hurtful. And so I think the idea of prodependence is to basically say, when people make an effort to help their spouse who is suffering from addiction, the motivation is love and concern, not necessarily some kind of mental illness that they're carrying around from unresolved childhood issues. And so, Rob has a great example he does in a talk of, using a cancer model. What would a wife or husband do with a partner who had cancer? And how would that look and how would that be described? Then he substitutes addiction for cancer, and suddenly it's all pathologized. So prodependence is really that idea of we're approaching this with love. So Scott, I know you can do a better job than that. So
no, I don't think I can. I mean, codependency, it didn't start out this way, but it morphed into this. It became a pathology. Like, if you choose to stay with an addict, there's obviously something wrong with you, and you're going to need to change, or the addict will never change. And that's inaccurate, number one. And it's blaming and shaming of you as the betrayed partner or the loved one. Number two, it's natural for the loved one of an addict or the loved one of a mentally ill person or a troubled person or a dying person to want to care for that person and to go above and beyond and to work 2 jobs to pay for childcare because the struggling partner can't take care of the kids, or to do things like that. And to, I know people who bought alcohol for the alcoholic and brought it home so that the alcoholic will drink at home because it's safer if the alcoholic doesn't get in the car. If there's no alcohol at home, the alcoholic will get in the car and go to the bar and get drunk and drive home and wreck and kill somebody. These are things that loved ones of addicts do that aren't necessarily healthy, but they're, as David said, it's out of love, it's out of care. And when Dr. Rob came up with the concept of prodependency, it's like, there's a book called Women Who Love Too Much. And the answer, the response is bullshit. You can't love too much. You can love ineffectively. You can love in ways that are not helpful. You can love in ways that might further the addiction. But instead of blaming and shaming and pathologizing the loved one or the betrayed partner, prodependence says, wow, isn't it nice that you love your person so much that you're willing to do this and to go out of your way. Let's celebrate that and see if we can find ways to help you help the struggling person more effectively and with better boundaries. The work that's done with codependency treatment and prodependence treatment is pretty much the same. It's about boundaries. It's about learning how to do things more effectively. It's about engaging in self-care, which a lot of us forget about when someone else is struggling. But it's really just a reframing, taking it out of a mythology and celebrating you for actually continuing to love someone despite their problems, and wanting to help them and finding ways to do it better. So it's kind of a reframing more than a totally different concept, although Dr. Roth might disagree with me. Why would a sex addict go to residential treatment repeatedly but not embrace sobriety? Why would any addict go to residential treatment repeatedly but not embrace sobriety, continuing to play the game? Is it common that an addict simply enjoys the ability to fool experts in addition to continuing to deceive his family? Great question.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for you. I think what an expensive game to do. And I think it's frustrating for me as a therapist when people choose to come week after week and not be honest. Like, what's the point? Just kind of wasting everybody's time. But I think, to me, when I see that behavior, first of all, we know, of course, denial is a huge part of addictive disorders. But I see fear all over that. Fear of what's going to happen if I really get sober? What am I going to lose? And I think a lot of addicts, something we don't talk about too much, but I think a lot of addicts have this fear of like, okay, if I get sober, who's there? What's left in there? What am I going to be? And there's a kind of a fear of what's on the other side. We know the pain on this side, but it's a familiar one. And I think many times we choose to stay in that rather than take that leap and see what's there. So I think, there's probably many motivators for somebody in that position, but I think typically denial and fear are the ones that come to mind for me. Just this inability to let go of this thing that's really killing us, but we can't really help ourselves. Yeah, go ahead.
There are people who will go to treatment to get their family off their back, or to keep their job or whatever. They have no intention of getting sober. There are people who go to treatment because they get R&R for 30 days. We see this a lot with drug addicts. I'm a mess right now. I weigh 87 pounds because I've been doing meth for 6 months straight. I go to rehab for 30 days or 60 days. I fatten up. I'm feeling better. I'm ready to go party again. That's a cycle that some people do. There could be 100 reasons. But sometimes it takes. I know people who've been to like 8 rehabs and suddenly they got to stayed sober.
That's right.
But as David said, expensive game to play. Yeah. Rehabs are not cheap. In my recovery, well, the question here is, do you think ADD has some correlation with me being a sex addict? Is there a link between ADD and addiction or sex addiction?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there's been some really good work on these co-occurring disorders, and ADHD and ADD are a high co-occurring disorder. I think it's in the area of between 20 and 30%, excuse me, of sex addicts have some kind of attention deficit issue. And we see that play out sometimes with this inability to tolerate boredom, to tolerate stillness, to tolerate kind of even sitting still. Boredom is a huge relapse risk for a lot of sex addicts. And so I think, there is a factor there. I see it with amphetamines as well. And of course, we know that amphetamines are the treatment. That's what do we do to treat ADHD? We prescribe amphetamines, and those are highly abused as well. And you talk to a meth addict, and if they have Vyvanse or Ritalin or Adderall on board, it's a very familiar feeling to methamphetamine. It's not quite as intense, but boy, especially if somebody's in recovery from meth, to take a drug like that is really tricky because they're suddenly their body knows, oh, I know that feeling. Let's have some more. So my point is that there is a high correlation here, and I think there's a lot of research that's been done on what's called sensation seeking, and this intolerance of boredom or still or low energy state, the emotional states, and the ability to kind of to go towards a shiny object and sensations. Excuse me. And what we're seeing, ironically, and this was a surprise to me, but the literature bears this out, you would think somebody that had a trauma history would not want to be in situations that would cause them anxiety, or cause that physical state that mimics anxiety, that kind of high racing heart and all that. Yet, people that have had that kind of trauma actually go for the intensity addictions. They go for the amphetamines, for the chemsex, for the sex addiction. for the porn as that sensation seeking. So there's something to it in a way that's kind of counterintuitive. You'd think people would want to just kind of stay away from any stimulation if they're anxious anyway, but actually they kind of run into it. And so, yeah, long way of answering your question. There is a relationship.
Yeah, we have a great podcast with Dr. Todd Love on ADHD and relationships and addiction. I just posted the link. I think we did one with Rob and one with you. I put the
Yeah,
link.
I've done one as well. Yeah,
I put the link with Dr. Rob in there. But there's also a podcast with David if you want to hear that one. You can go on our site and just type in into the search feature ADHD, ADHD rather than ADD, and both of those podcasts will come up for you. One last question here. When is it time to kick the sex addict out of the home? He says he wants to recover and love me, but he is not doing all the recovery work he needs to do. That is a loaded question.
Yeah, boy. You know, I don't know if I can give one general answer for that. I think it's really just individualized thing, because all of these factors that go on, what's the sincerity of the person? What are their addictions might be going on? What are the concerns? What are their mental health issues? I mean, what's going on? And I'm not saying that point doesn't come at some point when it's just, okay, this is not working for anybody. And I guess I do it in consultation with mental health professionals, therapists that know your situation. They're the best ones, I think, to give you unbiased advice. Sometimes, and there's, by the way, a step before that, which I would call it a therapeutic separation. Instead of just saying a black and white, okay, now you're in, now you're out. Maybe there's a chance to take 3 months or take 6 months with some therapeutic intention, separate, but stay connected and working through some stuff. That can be a nice way to solve that also. But I mean, for some people, yeah, that point is definitely there. There is a point at which, okay, this is not working, I'm over. But I think there's so many factors that go into that decision. It's unfair to kind of give a general rule. I would really refer you to a therapist that knows about the situation totally.
Yeah, you know, things like childcare and finances can play into that. I mean, you know, how do you pay for all this? Who takes care of it? You know, all that stuff. Even if you have animals, you gotta, who takes care of them? Who do they go with? You know, all that stuff. So yeah, professional assistance before you make that decision. I highly recommend it. So thank you everybody for being here. Thank you for letting us answer last week's questions, and we got through all of this week's. So we will be back next week, next Wednesday. Yeah, not an actual holiday. So we'll be here. David, anything you want to say to take us out?
I don't think so. Just thank you for the great questions. They were wonderful.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Celebrate. Have a great holiday, and we'll see you next week.
All right. Good night.